The laughter echoed like glass breaking, sharp, dismissive, final. She thought he was just the janitor until his words silenced the entire boardroom and made her question everything she believed about power. Before we dive in, take a second. Tell me in the comments where in the world you're watching from, and don't forget to hit subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you won't want to miss. Trust me, it'll blow your mind. The elevators at Brenton Tower sighed open with the sound of wealth, polished, weightless, and slightly smug. Jack Marlowe stepped out with his mop bucket and cart, invisible as always, another shadow slipping across marble that glowed under fluorescent perfection. It was near midnight, the witching hour for men like him, when offices emptied of executives but remained haunted by their voices, their decisions, their million-dollar echoes. He wore the uniform of the overlooked, navy coveralls faded at the knees, sturdy boots scuffed from years of labor, and hands roughened by both work and life. People rarely saw those hands for what they were, once steady on a conference table pen, once trusted with signatures that shifted markets. Now they only saw rubber gloves and a mop handle. And that was how Jack liked it. He moved quietly down the corridor, polishing chrome railings until they shone like knives. He overheard scraps of conversation as doors closed. Mergers whispered about like illicit affairs, rumors of scandals swept under the rug as though marble floors could hide them. The air inside Brenton Tower always smelled faintly of money, cold and metallic, as though even oxygen was rationed for profit. The janitor worked with the grace of habit. Push, wipe, rinse, repeat. He did not rush. Jack had learned that speed was for people desperate to be seen. The invisible, however, moved at their own pace. Home was 2 subway rides away, where Lily, his 10-year-old daughter, sat most nights with a frozen dinner and her sketchbook, waiting for the click of his key in the door. She drew towers and skylines, big worlds she believed her father belonged in. He'd seen her latest piece that morning, a skyscraper stretching past the clouds, with one tiny figure at the base holding it steady. She'd written beneath it in looping pencil, "Dad belongs up there." He carried that sketch in his mind the way some men carried photographs of old loves. Jack had once belonged up there. Years ago, another tower, different city, different life. He'd worn tailored suits, argued across mahogany tables, built projections that turned into empires. He'd been called visionary. He'd also been called reckless. But when the hospital bed swallowed his wife and left him a widower with a newborn, all the titles crumbled. He chose survival. He chose Lily. He walked away. Now, with a spray bottle in hand, he looked less like a former executive and more like what everyone believed him to be, a man who mopped floors. He preferred it that way. Less expectation, fewer eyes. People revealed themselves around those they did not see. And Jack had become fluent in listening. Tonight, though, the building was different. A buzz lingered in the air, sharp as static before a storm. The boardroom on the top floor was being readied for something historic. Rumors of a deal bigger than anything in recent memory, mergers that would redraw maps, layoffs that would erase families. Jack had no seat at that table, but he would be there regardless, polishing glass and aligning chairs with military precision. His work would outlast their words, though none of them would notice. As he wheeled his cart past the vast windows overlooking the city, he paused. Neon bled across the skyline, a kaleidoscope of lives lived in cubicles, apartments, and bars still open at midnight. Somewhere out there, Lily slept with a light still burning in her room, the sketchbook open on her nightstand. He thought about her quiet question from earlier that evening. "Do they know who you really are, Dad?" He had smiled, brushed the hair from her forehead, and told her no, but the truth was, he wasn't sure anymore if he knew. He ran a cloth over the glass doors of the boardroom, catching his own reflection. Hollow eyes, strong shoulders, a man who carried silence like armor. He set the rag down and breathed. The floor gleamed beneath him, ready for footsteps that mattered more than his. Yet somewhere deep in his chest, an old rhythm stirred, a faint drumbeat of a life he had buried but not forgotten. Fate, it seemed, had a way of finding those who tried hardest to disappear. And tonight, in the glittering glass fortress of Brenton Tower, Jack Marlowe's invisibility was about to end. Evelyn Hart entered the boardroom the way storms enter a coastline, sudden, undeniable, reshaping everything in their path. The room had already been staged for her arrival, chairs angled precisely toward the head of the table, water glasses aligned like obedient soldiers, the scent of polished wood still hanging in the air. Her assistants trailed 2 steps behind, arms full of folders and glowing screens, but no one dared to speak until she did. Evelyn didn't need to demand silence. She carried it with her, a cloak stitched from fear and respect. She wore a charcoal gray suit that gleamed under the recessed lighting, tailored so sharply it could have cut paper. The red of her heels tapped against the marble with deliberate rhythm, each step a declaration. Power wasn't in what she said, it was in what she allowed herself not to say. Men who built careers on charm or bravado often melted under her gaze, reduced to stammering boys who suddenly forgot the value of their own words. She had been called ruthless, cold, impossible, but she carried those labels like medals. To her, cruelty was just another tool, like leverage or capital. Evelyn Hart had not inherited her empire. She had clawed it into existence, brick by brick, deal by deal, mistake by mistake, until even her failures turned to stone beneath her heels. The board respected her because she had bled for every inch of ground she now stood on. The investors adored her because she never lost, and her competitors feared her because she never forgave. But tonight, there was something restless in her laughter. The deal that loomed ahead was the kind that could etch her name deeper into the marble of history, or shatter it into dust. The air in the boardroom pulsed with expectation. Every polished surface seemed to gleam brighter, as though reflecting the magnitude of what was to come. Evelyn thrived in moments like this, when the stakes were so high that lesser souls would crumble under the weight. She sank into her leather chair at the head of the table, her posture straight, her fingers drumming once against the glossy surface before she stilled them. Her eyes scanned the room, sharp as glass. She caught movement at the far side of the table, slow, unhurried, belonging not to a board member or an executive, but to the janitor. He was aligning chairs with quiet precision, his broad shoulders bent slightly forward, his gaze lowered, her lips curved. The laughter that escaped her was not warm. It never was. It was cool, dismissive, the sound of a woman who could dismantle a man's dignity with the same ease she signed contracts. "Careful," she said lightly, her voice carrying to every corner of the cavernous room. "If you polish those chairs any more, they might start believing they belong at the table." A ripple of laughter followed from the executives seated nearby, hesitant at first, then fuller, as though each chuckle was a loyalty oath to her authority. The janitor didn't look up. His movements remained steady, deliberate, as though her words had never touched him. That small refusal, his silence, his calm, irked her more than protest ever could have. Evelyn's laughter grew sharper, cutting through the air. "Do you hear me?" she asked, her tone playfully cruel now, designed to make the invisible visible for sport. At last he paused, just briefly, cloth in hand. He glanced her way, not long enough to be considered disrespectful, but long enough to let her see something she hadn't expected. His eyes weren't timid, they weren't resentful either. They were steady, unreadable, carrying the weight of a man who had lived more lives than anyone in this room could imagine. It unsettled her, just for a moment, a flicker. Then she brushed it off like lint on her sleeve. "Never mind," Evelyn said, dismissing him with a wave of her manicured hand. "Go on. Don't let me interrupt your masterpiece." Another laugh followed, softer this time, but still sharp enough to draw blood if anyone dared oppose it. The janitor returned to his work without a word, folding his cloth carefully, as though every crease mattered. Evelyn turned her focus back to the table, to the deal, to the empire she was about to expand. Yet somewhere at the back of her mind, his gaze lingered, like a note played too softly to ignore. She told herself it was nothing, just a man too proud to flinch at a joke. But deep down, though she would never admit it, she felt something dangerous in the way he carried himself. She had built her career on knowing people before they knew themselves. But tonight, without realizing it, Evelyn Hart had laughed at the one man in the room she didn't know at all. And soon, the truth he carried would cut sharper than her own words ever could. The apartment was small, 2 bedrooms pressed into a space meant for one, the walls carrying the faint scent of old wood and laundry detergent, the kind of place where the hum of the refrigerator could be heard in every room and the radiator hissed like a restless ghost in the winter. Jack didn't mind. He'd learned a long time ago that home wasn't about square footage, it was about who lived inside it. And for him, home was Lily. She sat cross-legged on her bed, a fortress of blankets piled around her, the soft glow of her bedside lamp falling over the sketchbook spread open across her lap. Her tongue peeked slightly from the corner of her mouth in concentration as her pencil darted across the page. She wasn't drawing stick figures or school doodles, she was building skylines, towers stretched into the clouds, windows stacked like ladders to the heavens, tiny bridges arching between impossible heights. At the very bottom of the page, a lone figure stood with broad shoulders, small compared to the buildings, but somehow holding them steady. She scrawled beneath it, in looping handwriting, "Dad belongs up there." Jack leaned against the doorframe, watching quietly. His chest tightened at the sight. For years he had scrubbed toilets, buffed floors, patched drywall, all while Lily, his sharp-eyed little dreamer, built universes in graphite and ink. To her, he wasn't a janitor in coveralls. He was the man who once lived among the towers she now drew, even if she didn't know the full truth of it. She only knew that her father carried something inside him that didn't match the mop bucket he pushed at night. "Another city?" he asked softly, stepping into the room. Lily looked up, grinning. "This one's taller than the last. You can see the tops of the clouds." Jack sat on the edge of her bed, careful not to crush her pencils scattered like fallen soldiers across the blanket. He picked up the sketchbook, turning it toward him. The details stunned him every time, the perspective lines, the way she shaded glass so it looked alive. But it was the captions that undid him. Simple words in a child's hand, yet heavy as stone. "Dad belongs up there." He ruffled her hair gently. "You're getting too good at this. Soon I'll be asking you for lessons." She giggled, tucking her legs under the blanket. "You don't need lessons. You already know how to build things, big things." Jack swallowed, his throat tightening. Maybe once. Her eyes searched his, too wise for 10 years old. "Do they know who you really are?" The question floated between them, fragile but piercing. For a moment, Jack couldn't breathe. He saw flashes of another life, boardrooms, handshakes, projections written on glass walls. He saw his wife's smile, fading beneath hospital lights. He saw himself walking away, carrying a newborn in one arm and his broken future in the other. He forced a smile now, reaching to brush a stray strand of hair from Lily's forehead. "They don't need to," he said gently. She frowned, as if the answer wasn't enough, but she didn't press. She closed the sketchbook with a soft thud and slid it under her pillow like a secret. Jack tucked the blankets around her shoulders, the gesture practiced and tender, the same way a soldier checks his rifle, careful, precise, reverent. He kissed her temple, inhaling the faint scent of shampoo and graphite. "You going to work now?" she asked, voice drowsy. "Yeah," he said. "I'll be back before you wake." "Promise?" "Promise." Her eyes fluttered shut, but before sleep claimed her, she whispered, "One day they'll see. Just like I do." Jack sat there for a long moment, watching her breathe, his hand resting on the blanket near her small fingers. The radiator hissed. The city hummed beyond the thin glass of their window, but all he heard was her question, echoing in the quiet. Do they know who you really are? He stood finally, pulling on his jacket. In the mirror by the door, he caught his reflection. A man in a janitor's uniform, shoulders bent under years of invisible weight. But behind his eyes, just for a flicker, the ghost of another man appeared, the builder, the strategist, the one who once walked among towers. He exhaled long and steady, then stepped into the night. And though he told himself he was content with invisibility, the truth pressed harder than ever. His daughter's belief was a light he couldn't hide from forever. One day, whether he wanted it or not, the world would have to see him again. The boardroom of Brenton Tower looked less like a meeting space and more like a cathedral to money. Polished walnut stretched the length of the table, its sheen reflecting the warm glow of recessed lights that burned long past midnight. Crystal decanters caught the light like prisms, half filled with amber liquor, meant to oil the voices of men who had never known what it meant to go without. Their laughter was too loud for the hour, the kind of laughter that cracked like glass, sharp and careless, echoing against the floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the city below. Outside, thousands of lives carried on unseen, but inside this room, the world belonged to a select few who had learned how to speak its language and bend it to their will. Evelyn Hart sat at the head of the table, as effortless as gravity. She didn't just command the room, she conducted it, her words slicing and cueing, her silences more commanding than applause. She was immaculate, her posture straight, her gaze sharp, every flick of her hand orchestrating the billion-dollar overtures playing out around her. The executives hung on her approval like schoolboys craving gold stars. They filled the air with a vocabulary of conquest. Equity, leverage, margins, collapse. These weren't just deals, these were declarations of war dressed in tailored suits. Jack moved in the background, quiet, steady, folding chairs back into place, wiping the condensation rings from glasses left behind, aligning each object with a precision that no one would notice but him. To the men in the room, he was furniture, a fixture, another cog ensuring their empire gleamed for the next act. They talked over him, around him, through him, and he allowed it. Invisibility was a skill he'd perfected. Still, invisibility didn't mean deafness. He caught the words tossed like scraps across the table, casual and cruel. One of the younger executives, tie loosened, glass half raised, sneered, "The help doesn't understand real value." To them, value is a paycheck at the end of the week. Laughter erupted, heavy and indulgent, swelling until it filled the space. It was the kind of laughter that didn't just exclude, it crushed, reminding anyone listening of where the lines were drawn. Jack paused mid-motion, cloth in hand. His back straightened just slightly. His face remained calm, but in his chest something shifted. A quiet fire, steady and old, sparked awake. He lowered his gaze to the table he was wiping, the wood catching the light like a mirror. For a moment, he saw himself reflected there, not as they saw him, but as he once was. A man who had known value beyond numbers, a man who had built things with his own hands and mind, not inherited, not mocked. He folded the cloth with deliberate care, smoothing its edges as if weighing his next move. The room continued buzzing behind him, Evelyn's voice slicing through the conversation, redirecting it back to strategy. But Jack barely heard the specifics anymore. The word value still clung to him, sharp, insulting, alive. He thought of Lily's sketchbook tucked under her pillow at home, the words she had written. "Dad belongs up there." He thought of how easily these men dismissed him, how easily the world had let him vanish, and how one child's belief in him made their arrogance suddenly unbearable. He finished aligning the last chair, his fingers steady, his expression unreadable. He could keep polishing, keep folding, keep disappearing as he always had, or he could let the fire flicker into words. His silence was armor, but even armor cracked when pressure became too great. Jack stood there, cloth folded neatly in his hands, invisible but not absent. The laughter around him dulled, like a storm drifting farther away, but the question it left behind burned bright. Would he keep being the shadow they wanted, or was it time finally to step back into the light he had abandoned? The answer hadn't left his lips yet, but the decision had already begun writing itself in the stillness of his chest. The circus carried on around him, blind to the fact that one quiet man was deciding whether to end the show. The boardroom was humming with noise again, that particular blend of expensive laughter and self-congratulation that always seemed to seep into the walls after midnight. Papers rustled, glasses clinked, and the glow of city lights spilled across the glass table like spilled jewels. Jack moved silently at its edges, the folded cloth in his hand sliding over the wood with steady strokes. He was adjusting a chair when Evelyn's voice cut through the noise, cool and sharp, carrying just enough volume to pull every pair of eyes with it. "Careful," she said, leaning back in her seat, a smirk tugging at her lips. "If you keep checking every detail, someone might mistake you for auditing the company." The remark drew a round of chuckles, the kind meant more for performance than genuine amusement. Even the youngest executive joined in, eager to echo Evelyn's rhythm, to be part of the chorus of her authority. Jack didn't move for a moment. He let the laughter wash over him, let the sound fill the space like static. His hand stilled on the cloth, pressing gently into the wood grain as if grounding himself there. He had endured this kind of dismissal 100 times in 100 ways, ignored, overlooked, mocked for caring about work no one valued. He could have stayed silent. He almost always did. But something shifted. Maybe it was Lily's voice echoing from earlier in the evening, her question hanging in the air like a dare. "Do they know who you really are?" Maybe it was the arrogance in Evelyn's tone, so sure of itself, so careless in its cruelty. Or maybe it was simply that the word audit reminded him of a life he hadn't touched in years, a life where his attention to detail wasn't a joke, but a weapon. He straightened, turning slightly toward her, his voice calm, deliberate, carrying just enough weight to slice through the laughter without raising in volume. "Funny thing about numbers," he said, pausing just long enough to ensure no one missed it. "They don't care who counts them." The laughter stopped as if someone had slammed a door. Silence rippled through the room, sharp and sudden, the kind that made even the air feel heavier. Every eye swung back toward him, confusion and discomfort stirring at the edges of their expressions. Jack didn't shift under the attention. His stance remained steady, his tone unshaken, as if he had merely stated a fact too obvious to ignore. Evelyn blinked once, her smile tightening before she leaned back further in her chair. She tapped her manicured nail against the stem of her glass, letting the sound replace the silence. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the same dismissive melody as before, but there was a new edge beneath it, something more alert, more curious. "Numbers don't care," she repeated softly, as though tasting the words, "but people do. And in this room we decide what they mean." Her gaze locked on him, and though her lips curved with amusement, her eyes studied him too closely. It was a glance she usually reserved for competitors across negotiation tables, the kind that searched for weak spots disguised as confidence. But she found no tremor in him, no apology in his expression. His calm only unsettled her further. Around the table, the executives shifted in their seats, unsure whether to laugh again or remain silent. They had watched Evelyn humiliate dozens of men and women in this very room, yet this janitor had turned her jest into something else entirely, something they didn't quite know how to name. Jack, for his part, bent again toward the chair he'd been straightening, folding the cloth neatly, resuming his work as though nothing had passed between them at all. His composure was more striking than defiance. It wasn't rebellion, wasn't anger. It was truth dropped into a room built on performance. Evelyn sipped her wine, masking her pause with elegance. Outwardly, she smirked as though the exchange had amused her. Inwardly, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't expected, recognition. She knew that kind of steadiness, She had wielded it herself once, long before she learned that cruelty bought faster obedience than kindness ever could. She leaned back in her chair, the smirk fixed, but her mind restless. She told herself it was nothing, just a clever reply from a man too stubborn to laugh at himself. Yet even as the conversation resumed, she couldn't let go of the line. Numbers don't care who counts them. Simple, undeniable, true. And without knowing it, in mocking the janitor's meticulous care, Evelyn Hart had cracked open the smallest door. A door she didn't realize led straight to the unraveling of her own story. And the janitor's closet was no bigger than a walk-in coffin, its walls lined with shelves stacked high with cleaning supplies, cardboard boxes, and plastic jugs that reeked faintly of bleach. A single bulb hummed overhead, throwing a tired cone of light onto the cracked linoleum. Jack sat on an overturned bucket in the center of it all, elbows on his knees, staring at his hands like they belonged to someone else. They were strong hands, broad, veined, still carrying the stubborn strength of a man who'd labored in more ways than one. But they weren't just hands that held a mop or turned the handle of a vacuum. Once, they had been instruments of creation. Hands that sketched models on whiteboards, hands that signed contracts worth more than he cared to remember, hands that once carried the confidence of a man who believed he could shape the future. They had clapped the backs of colleagues, steered teams through storms, and tapped out ideas late at night that became innovations by morning. Now they smelled faintly of disinfectant. He flexed his fingers slowly, as though the act itself might conjure some trace of the man he used to be. But all that came was silence, broken only by the low hum of the bulb and the muffled echoes of laughter drifting faintly from the boardroom down the hall. Those voices belonged to men who thought value was a word they owned. He remembered being one of them once, or at least near enough to recognize the same hollow arrogance that now filled Brenton Tower. His throat tightened, and he whispered a name into the stillness. Rachel. The sound of it cracked something in him every time. Rachel. His wife, his partner, his compass. Gone now, years buried, but never faded. The hospital room returned to him in flashes, the pale walls, the relentless machines, the sterile smell of a place that stole more than it saved. He remembered holding her hand as it grew colder, remembered promising her that he would take care of Lily no matter the cost. And he had. He had walked away from everything else, the corner office, the title, the prestige that once made people lean in when he spoke. He traded it all for survival, for fatherhood, for the simple, unglamorous truth of being there when Lily woke from nightmares or needed help with her homework. He chose invisibility because ambition came with a spotlight, and spotlights don't raise children, not alone. But now, sitting in that closet, the weight of her question echoed louder than the laughter from the boardroom. "Do they know who you really are, Dad?" Lily's voice, innocent and piercing, clung to him like a shadow. He had smiled at her, told her they didn't need to know, but inside the answer had twisted deeper. Did he even know any more? Or had invisibility become less a choice and more a prison? He rubbed his palms together, the roughness of his skin scraping softly in the still air. Hiding had protected Lily. It had given her a stable life, free from the chaos of ambition and the merciless grind of industries that chewed men alive. But what had it cost him? Every time he folded another cloth, buffed another table, aligned another chair, he felt the faint echoes of a life he'd abandoned pressing harder against the walls of his chest, a life that hadn't just been about numbers or success, it had been about purpose. And now that purpose sat unused, buried under fluorescent lights and mop buckets. He closed his eyes and saw Rachel again. She used to tease him that he worked like he was racing an invisible clock, like every project was life or death. "One day," she'd whispered once, tracing her fingers over his knuckles, "you're going to have to slow down and ask yourself if you're building for the world or for us." He hadn't slowed down until the world forced him to. Now, years later, the question came back sharper, heavier. Was he still building for her memory, for Lily's safety, or had he stopped building altogether? The bulb flickered once overhead. Jack drew in a slow breath, resting his hands on his knees again. They looked worn, yes, but still capable, still alive. In the quiet, he wondered if Rachel would recognize the man he had become. More painfully, he wondered if Lily would one day resent him for hiding when he should have fought to stand in the light again. The closet door stayed closed, but Jack knew he couldn't keep its walls around him forever. The echoes of another life were getting louder, and no amount of silence could muffle them now. Morning sunlight spilled across the glass facade of Brenton Tower, catching the city below in fragments of gold and silver. Inside, the boardroom gleamed as if it were made of mirrors, every surface polished to perfection, every chair precisely aligned around the massive walnut table. Evelyn Hart sat at its head, poised like a queen waiting for her court to entertain her. The executives clustered nearby were restless, sipping their coffee, scrolling through their phones, eager for the coming spectacle. They weren't here to listen to ideas. They were here to watch Evelyn flex her power. Jack Marlowe entered quietly, pushing open the heavy glass doors with the same composure he carried when wheeling a mop bucket down a midnight hallway. He didn't belong in that room, and everyone knew it. His coveralls marked him as invisible. But invisibility doesn't erase presence, and the stillness he carried into the space unsettled them before he even spoke. "Mr. Marlowe," Evelyn said, her voice dripping with smooth disdain, "we thought we'd take a little detour this morning." "My team seems curious." She let the words linger, then smiled with polished cruelty. "Tell us, what could a janitor possibly know about running a billion-dollar company?" The question was a blade wrapped in silk. The executives chuckled, some nervously, some with eager malice, waiting for Jack to falter. This was entertainment, a break in their routine, the perfect way to remind themselves that the distance between them and the man who polished their table was infinite. Jack didn't flinch. He didn't shift his weight or lower his gaze. He looked directly at Evelyn, and something about his steady eyes sent a faint ripple of discomfort through the room. He waited until the laughter died on its own, until the silence pressed tight against the walls. Then, with a calm voice that seemed far too measured for the uniform he wore, he began. "Funny thing about billion-dollar companies," he said softly, "they forget they're made of people. People who get tired, people who get scared, people who sometimes give their best years for promises that vanish the second a market shifts." The smirks around the table began to fade, replaced by cautious stillness. Evelyn leaned back in her chair, her smile thin, concealing curiosity with contempt. Jack's words weren't loud, but they landed with weight, each one anchoring itself into the silence. "I've seen markets climb," he continued, his voice even, "and I've seen them collapse. I've seen leaders celebrate profits one quarter and lay off hundreds the next, calling it efficiency. They talk about volatility as though it's just numbers on a graph, but volatility has faces. It looks like the father explaining to his kids why Christmas will be smaller this year. It looks like the mother calculating rent against insulin. No one moved. Even the hum of the city seemed to hush against the glass walls. "You think I clean your floors, and I do," Jack said, folding his hands in front of him. "But I also listen. I hear what people say when they think no one's listening. I hear executives brag about beating a rival, while an assistant in the corner wonders how she'll pay her student loans. I hear jokes about value made by men who've never had to wonder if their paycheck would stretch far enough to keep the lights on." An uneasy silence spread across the table, a slow realization settling in. Jack wasn't stammering, wasn't apologizing. He was telling the truth in a language they all understood but rarely heard spoken without filters. Evelyn's fingers tapped lightly against her glass, the only sound in the room. Her eyes narrowed. But beneath the edge of her smirk there was something else, an awareness that this man was not playing the role she had assigned him. Jack's final words cut sharper than anything before. "A company worth billions can collapse overnight. I've seen it. But the damage isn't in the numbers. The damage is in the lives it leaves behind. And if you forget that, if you keep pretending that ambition justifies everything, then you're not leading. You're gambling with other people's blood. The silence that followed was absolute. It stretched long enough that the executives shifted uncomfortably in their seats, glancing at Evelyn for cues that never came. Jack stepped back slightly, folding the cloth he had carried in with him, his expression calm as though he had merely answered a routine question. He wasn't defensive, he wasn't ashamed, he was simply steady. Evelyn leaned back, crossing one leg over the other, her smile faint and unreadable. "Well," she said smoothly, "that was more than I expected." Her tone was dismissive, but her eyes betrayed her, lingering on him longer than they should have. What none of them knew, not Evelyn, not her board, not even Jack himself, was that in that moment, with words spoken softly but with thunder behind them, something had cracked open. The spark had been struck, and nothing in that glittering tower would ever be the same again. The boardroom was quieter than it had any right to be. The city outside roared with morning traffic, horns and engines and the distant thrum of construction. Yet inside the glass fortress of Brenton Tower, it felt as though the world had been sealed off. Words still lingered in the air, heavy, unwelcomed intruders that refused to leave. Jack had spoken them calmly, steadily, like a man who hadn't planned to make a speech but couldn't stop truth once it rose to the surface. Evelyn Hart leaned back in her chair, forcing a laugh that sounded too polished, too sharp, a brittle imitation of ease. The executives chuckled with her, eager to mirror their queen, but the laughter cracked too quickly, fading before it could fill the room. Beneath her controlled poise, her eyes betrayed something far less comfortable, something that looked unsettlingly like recognition, maybe even fear. She had heard truths spoken in negotiations, had faced rivals with knives behind their smiles, but none of them had disarmed her with simplicity the way this janitor had. Jack stood near the far end of the table, his hands resting lightly against the back of a chair. He wasn't grandstanding, he wasn't looking for applause. His presence was calm, unhurried, almost quiet. Yet his words had carried a weight that bent the air around him. He looked at Evelyn, then at the circle of men in expensive suits who suddenly seemed smaller in their chairs. He let the silence stretch until it trembled, and then he said it. "You don't know who you're talking to." The phrase landed like a pin dropped in a cathedral. No one moved. No one breathed. It wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. The truth in it was alive, unshakable, a spark that ignited without flame. He wasn't boasting, he wasn't threatening. He was simply stating a fact, a reminder that they had all mistaken him for something far less than what he carried inside. Evelyn's chest tightened. For the first time in years, she felt the ground beneath her stutter, the polished certainty she had worn like armor slipping at the edges. She told herself it was nonsense, that this was just a man clever enough to sound bigger than he was, and yet her instincts, the ones that had built her empire, screamed otherwise. The steadiness in his gaze wasn't borrowed confidence, it was lived experience. He wasn't bluffing. Around the table, the executives shifted uncomfortably, their expensive pens clicking nervously against their notepads. Some avoided Jack's eyes entirely, staring instead at Evelyn, waiting for her to shatter the moment with a cutting remark. But Evelyn didn't speak. She couldn't. Not yet. Her throat felt thick, her voice caught between mockery and hesitation. Jack straightened, folding the cloth in his hand with the same deliberate care he gave everything. Then he placed it back on his cart, as though setting down a closing argument. His expression didn't change, steady, calm, certain, and in that steadiness was something Evelyn hadn't expected. Dignity. It was the kind of dignity that didn't ask for permission, didn't wait for recognition, didn't crumble under laughter. For years, she had believed power came from control, from being sharper, louder, faster than anyone else. But now, watching him, she felt something different. His power came from stillness, from the quiet weight of a man who knew exactly what he'd lost and exactly what he still carried. The glass walls of the boardroom seemed thinner now, fragile under the weight of his words. Evelyn's reflection stared back at her from their gleaming surface, but it looked different, less certain, less untouchable. She hated the feeling. She also couldn't look away. Jack turned toward the door, his movements unhurried. He didn't wait for dismissal. He didn't bow his head. He simply left the words behind him, echoing louder than anything Evelyn or her executives could summon in reply. When the door closed, silence pressed harder than before. Evelyn inhaled, steadying herself, then forced her lips into a smirk. "Well," she said, her voice sharp but thinner than usual, "that was entertaining." The men nodded, eager to follow her lead, but none of them laughed. Not this time. Evelyn swirled the wine in her glass, watching the liquid catch the light. She told herself she had won, that she had reduced him back to what he was, a janitor who'd spoken out of turn. But deep down, beneath layers of pride and polish, she knew the truth. Something had cracked, and once glass shatters, it never truly looks whole again. The hallways of Brenton Tower had always been alive with whispers, but now the whispers had a name: Jack Marlowe, the janitor, the man in coveralls who had spoken in the boardroom as though he belonged at the head of the table instead of at its edge. By mid-morning, the story had spread through 3 floors, carried not by emails or memos, but by lowered voices and half-hidden glances. Some laughed it off immediately. They called it a fluke, a coincidence, a lucky line from a man too simple to know what he'd stumbled into. "Even a broken clock," one executive muttered over his cappuccino, smirking as though the matter was already settled. Others, however, weren't as sure. They replayed the moment in their minds, the calmness in Jack's tone, the way his words didn't land like guesses, but like truths no one else had dared to say aloud. It unsettled them, though none of them would ever admit it out loud. In the cafeteria, assistants leaned across tables, whispering that they had never seen Evelyn so still after someone else spoke. In the elevators, managers speculated whether the janitor had some strange background no one knew about. Whispers grew legs, and soon they were climbing the tower faster than any memo could. A man invisible for years had, in the span of a minute, become unforgettable. Evelyn Hart tried to suffocate it before it grew. She walked the corridors with her usual poise, dismissing the murmurs with a wave of her manicured hand whenever they drifted close enough to hear. "A janitor got lucky," she said once, her voice smooth as glass. "Don't mistake luck for insight." But even as she said it, her chest tightened. She knew luck when she saw it. What she had witnessed was not luck. Alone in her office, behind glass walls that overlooked the city, Evelyn replayed his words in her mind, again and again. "You don't know who you're talking to." Simple, steady, truth, not bravado. It was the way he had looked at her when he said it that unnerved her most. Not with defiance, not with pleading, but with the unshakable certainty of someone who had nothing left to prove. She had spent her entire life cultivating that same steadiness, sharpening it until her very presence disarmed rivals. Yet when he said those words, it was she who felt exposed. She poured herself a drink, though it was still before noon, letting the burn steady her. But it didn't. The taste only reminded her of the countless nights she had toasted victories that still left her empty afterward. Jack's words, irritating in their persistence, rattled around inside her like a key searching for a lock. Who was this man? Her reflection in the glass caught her off guard. For a moment, she didn't see the CEO in her sharp suit. She saw the girl she once was, the foster child with cheap shoes and a stubborn fire, the girl who had been laughed at too many times for dreaming too loudly. Evelyn had built herself into someone untouchable to escape that reflection. And now, a janitor's presence had dragged it back, as though he had peeled away the armor she wore and left her staring at the truth beneath. She closed her eyes and exhaled slowly, willing the thought away. He was just a man who happened to speak well, a curiosity, nothing more. But the lie refused to settle. Outside her office, The whispers continued. Some spoke of Jack with amusement, others with unease, but all with curiosity. Evelyn heard them without hearing, her mind elsewhere, circling the same question she couldn't shake. Who was he really? And why did it feel for the first time in years like she wasn't the only one in this tower who could command a room? She pressed her hand lightly against the glass wall, staring out at the city stretched beneath her like a kingdom she had conquered. Yet all the steel, all the glass, all the billions behind her name did nothing to quiet the thought rising unbidden, persistent as breath. If I don't know who he is, maybe I don't know who I am anymore either. The apartment was quiet in the late afternoon, the kind of quiet that comes not from peace, but from the absence of a presence. Jack was at work, the low hum of his routine already carrying him across the city, and Lily was left to fill the silence with her imagination. She had spread her crayons across the coffee table, sketching her usual skylines, towers that pierced the clouds, windows catching the sun like mirrors. But today her pencil hesitated, the lines less certain. Her father's words from the night before kept circling in her mind, the way he had smiled so gently when she asked if people knew who he really was. "They don't need to," he had said, but she wasn't so sure. She wandered into his room barefoot on the creaking floorboards. The space was sparse, almost austere, as though he hadn't allowed himself the luxury of decorating. A bed neatly made, a small dresser, a nightstand with a lamp that flickered when it was first turned on. Nothing spoke loudly here, but everything was tidy, deliberate, cared for with the same precision he gave to polishing a piano or scrubbing a floor. It was in the dresser that she found it. At first she only meant to look for a sharper pencil. Her father always kept spares in odd places. But when she slid open the drawer, her eyes caught on something that didn't belong among socks and folded shirts. A notebook, leather-bound, its edges worn, its cover cracked from years of use. She pulled it out carefully, as though the object itself might break apart in her hands. Sitting on the edge of the bed, Lily opened it. The pages inside weren't filled with grocery lists or reminders. They were alive. Diagrams of buildings, blueprints drawn with crisp, confident strokes, strategy notes written in margins, tiny annotations of meetings that must have happened long before she was born. Half-finished plans for something bold, something immense, a company, an idea, a dream that had never stepped out of paper and into the world. Her breath caught as she traced her small fingers over the sketches. There were towers here, towers just like the ones she had been drawing for years, only sharper, more precise. Her father's handwriting was quick, confident, the kind of script that belonged to someone who knew others would one day read his words. Words about growth, about vision, about teams and futures. She frowned, tilting her head. This wasn't the writing of a janitor. This wasn't the work of someone who had chosen invisibility. This was someone who had once stood among giants, maybe even led them. Her heart swelled with a complicated ache. Pride, yes, because it confirmed what she had always felt in her bones, that her dad was more than the world saw, but also sadness, because the notebook was closed, tucked away, hidden like a secret too heavy to carry in the open. He had put it in a drawer, just as he had put himself in the shadows. She turned the pages slowly, careful not to smudge the faded ink. Some notes were practical, funding schedules, projections. Others were almost poetic, scribbled lines about possibility, about shaping a world where people could build without being crushed by it. On one page, he had written a single line in larger letters. "We build not just to rise, but to carry others with us." Lily felt her throat tighten. She thought of him polishing the piano with the same reverence, folding cleaning cloths with deliberate care, speaking softly when others mocked him. It all fit together now. He hadn't stopped being who he was. He had only hidden it. She closed the notebook gently, hugging it to her chest. It smelled faintly of paper and dust, of years locked away. For a long moment, she just sat there, staring at the cracked leather cover, listening to the faint tick of the radiator. She wanted to run to him, to hold it out, to ask why he never told her. But she didn't. Not yet. Instead, she slid it under her pillow the way she did with her own sketchbook, clutching it like a secret. She would wait. She would give him time because she knew her father carried silence like armor. One day, she believed, he would finally lay it down. One day he would tell her the truth. Until then, she whispered to the notebook, as if it could hear her, "I knew you were more." And she held it tightly, the weight of his hidden past pressing against her small chest, as though it belonged to her as much as it belonged to him. The city glittered beneath her, a jeweled expanse spread out like an empire she had carved with her own hands. From the floor-to-ceiling windows of her penthouse, Evelyn Hart watched it all in silence, a glass of red wine balanced loosely between her fingers. The skyline was hers. She had clawed her way to the top of every tower, negotiated her way into every boardroom, and stamped her name onto contracts that would outlive her. By all accounts, she had won. And yet, tonight, the lights felt colder. She sank into the leather sofa, heels kicked carelessly aside, her suit jacket draped over the armrest. The performance of the day was over. No sharp smiles, no cutting remarks, no orchestration of power plays. Just her, alone, and the echo of words she couldn't shake. "You don't know who you're talking to." They replayed over and over, quiet but relentless, as though the janitor had left them behind in the boardroom like a shard of glass embedded under her skin. She had tried to laugh it off, to bury the moment under the weight of her own authority. But the tone of his voice gnawed at her. He hadn't said it to humiliate her, or even to challenge her. He had said it with certainty, with the calm of a man who knew exactly who he was, even if no one else did. And that unsettled her more than any rival ever had. She pressed the glass to her lips and took a slow sip, letting the burn distract her, if only for a second. But the distraction didn't last. Memories she had long kept buried began to stir, uninvited. She saw herself as a child again, sitting on the edge of a narrow cot in a foster home that smelled of mildew and despair. Her shoes were hand-me-downs, 2 sizes too big, and her clothes never fit right. She remembered the way the other kids laughed at her when she said she wanted to be more than what the world had handed her. "You? A CEO?" The words had been mocking, cruel, laced with the certainty that she would never escape. But she had. She built walls so high that no one could laugh at her anymore. She armored herself with designer suits and sharpened her tongue into a blade. She vowed never again to feel powerless, never again to let anyone see the girl with scuffed shoes and impossible dreams. And for years, the mask had worked. She was Evelyn Hart, untouchable, unstoppable, feared and admired in equal measure, until him. She closed her eyes, leaning back against the sofa, her head tipping toward the ceiling. Why did his presence linger the way it did? He hadn't tried to impress her. He hadn't tried to win favor. He hadn't even raised his voice. But in his calm, in his refusal to flinch beneath her laughter, he had seen something she thought she had buried so deep no one could reach it. He had seen through the performance. Evelyn set the glass down on the table with more force than she intended, the crystal ringing faintly against the wood. Her reflection caught in the window beyond, and for a brief moment she didn't see the woman she had crafted. She saw the girl again, the foster kid who stayed up at night whispering promises into the dark, the one who said she would never let the world laugh at her again. Her throat tightened. She hated the vulnerability creeping in, hated that the echo of one man's words could stir cracks in armor that had taken her decades to build. And yet, beneath the hatred, was something else, something quieter, more dangerous. Recognition. She knew that steadiness, that calm strength. She had once carried it herself before she replaced it with sharpness and performance. She pressed her palm against the cold glass of the window, staring out at the skyline. The towers still gleamed, but they no longer looked like trophies. They looked like reminders, monuments not to victory, but to how far she had run from the girl who first dreamed of them. For the first time in years, Evelyn Hart felt exposed, not because she was weak, but because someone, a man in coveralls with a folded cloth in his hands, had seen her clearly. And the truth was harder to face than any rival across a negotiation table. She wasn't untouchable. She was still human, and someone else had noticed. The lobby of Brenton Tower was all glass and marble, polished so perfectly it reflected back the ambition of everyone who walked across it. Morning light spilled through the high windows, catching in the chrome railings and gilded logos, making the place look less like an office building and more like a temple to power. It was here, under the watchful eyes of passing executives and the faint hum of the city beyond, that Evelyn Hart cornered Jack Marlowe. Her heels struck the marble with the sharp rhythm of warning shots, each step echoing through the open space. Heads turned, but no one intervened. People always knew better than to get in Evelyn Hart's way. She cut across the lobby floor like a storm gathering speed, her jaw set, her eyes fixed on the man in coveralls pushing his cart toward the elevators. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice low but edged with steel. Jack stopped mid-step. He didn't flinch, didn't bow his head, didn't scramble to explain himself the way so many others had when Evelyn's focus narrowed on them. He simply turned toward her, his expression calm, his presence as steady as stone. For a moment the noise of the lobby seemed to recede, the shuffle of shoes, the murmur of conversation, even the squeak of a rolling suitcase somewhere behind them. He reached into his pocket, not for words, but for something folded and worn. He held it out to her between two fingers, a small piece of paper, creased at the edges, softened by handling. Evelyn hesitated before taking it, her manicured hand brushing against the roughness of his fingers. When she unfolded it, her breath caught. It was a drawing, a child's drawing. Pencil lines forming a towering skyscraper that stretched into the clouds, windows glittering like stars. And at the base of the building, small but unmistakable, stood a man, broad-shouldered, tall, strong enough that the skyscraper seemed to rise from his very presence. Beneath it, in looping handwriting, were 5 words, "Dad belongs up there." Evelyn stared at it, her throat tightening against a sensation she hadn't felt in years. The drawing was simple, imperfect in a way only a child's hand could create, but it carried a weight that no blueprint, no contract, no corporate plan ever had. It was truth rendered without calculation, a vision drawn not for profit, but from faith. Jack's voice broke the silence, soft but steady. "Ask yourself," he said, his eyes never leaving hers, "why a child sees more truth than you." The words landed heavier than if he'd shouted them. He wasn't accusing her, he wasn't mocking. He was simply laying bare something she hadn't wanted to face. That her polished empire, her billion-dollar deals, her untouchable reputation, all of it paled next to the unshakable belief of a little girl. For the first time in as long as she could remember, Evelyn Hart found herself speechless. Her mouth opened, but no sound came. The drawing trembled slightly in her hand, though her grip was tight. Around them, people still moved through the lobby, but it all blurred at the edges, reduced to background noise. The only thing clear was the paper in her hand and the man who had given it to her. Jack didn't wait for her reply. He simply nodded once, a gesture more final than a bow, and turned back to his cart. His steps were steady, unhurried, as though he had nothing left to prove. The elevator doors slid open, and he disappeared inside, leaving Evelyn standing alone with the sketch. She looked down again at the simple lines, at the tiny figure holding up the impossible. It felt heavier than her empire, heavier than the glass tower around her, heavier than the mask she had worn for decades. She had built her life on control, on making sure no one ever saw weakness in her. But here, in the middle of her own fortress, a child's drawing had stripped away every layer of armor she thought she owned. And as the elevator doors closed behind Jack, Evelyn realized with a jolt of unease that she didn't just want to know who he was. She needed to, because the paper trembling in her hand had reminded her of something she had long forgotten, something raw, something real, and it terrified her more than any rival ever had. The chandeliers in the ballroom sparkled like constellations, their light scattering across sequined gowns and tailored tuxedos. Music drifted from the string quartet in the corner, a polished melody designed to blend into conversation rather than command it. The charity gala had all the trappings of grandeur: champagne flutes raised with forced laughter, waiters moving like shadows with silver trays, and donors competing to be noticed for their generosity. Evelyn Hart was exactly where she belonged, in the wings, orchestrating it all, her presence as deliberate as the lighting that bathed the stage in gold. The evening had followed its script without fault. Speeches were delivered, checks exchanged, applause performed. But then, without warning, the script unraveled. A small figure stepped out from the side of the stage. Lily, her hair was tucked back in a loose braid, her shoes slightly scuffed against the polished floor. In her hand was no script, no prepared note, only the quiet certainty of a child who believed her voice mattered. She paused at the microphone, adjusting it with both hands, the crowd beginning to murmur at the sight of her. Evelyn's breath caught in her chest. Jack had been standing at the back of the hall, invisible as ever, but his daughter had just pulled the curtain of invisibility off both of them. The room hushed. Lily's voice was small at first, trembling, but she steadied herself with the kind of courage that adults forget how to summon. "My dad," she said, glancing toward the back where Jack stood frozen, "isn't just a janitor." The words rang sharper than any orchestra. Conversations died instantly, the silence spreading across the glittering tables like spilled wine. Eyes turned, some confused, some intrigued, others ready to laugh until they realized she wasn't joking. "He's the one who taught me that real power," Lily continued, her voice finding strength, "isn't about shouting the loudest. It's about listening. It's about being quiet enough to hear what other people need, even when no one else is paying attention." The innocence of it pierced the crowd. Men who made their fortunes shouting down rivals shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Women who had clawed their way through boardrooms lowered their eyes, remembering moments when silence might have meant more than conquest. A child had just named what none of them wanted to admit, that their kind of power was brittle, shallow, unsustainable. At the edge of the stage, Evelyn gripped the curtain tighter, her knuckles pale. Something twisted inside her chest, sharp and unfamiliar. She had spent her entire life turning truth into something negotiable, something that could be spun, controlled, sold. But this small, unvarnished voice cut through layers of armor she hadn't realized she still wore. Lily looked out at the sea of faces, unafraid now. "My dad says you don't need to be seen to matter. But I see him. I see how strong he is, even when nobody else does." The words fell like stones into water, each ripple spreading wider, deeper. Evelyn felt it more keenly than anyone. She had mocked that strength only nights ago, reduced it to a joke about polished chairs and over-earnest hands. And now a child's truth made her cruelty feel small, hollow. Applause rose hesitantly, then stronger, rolling through the ballroom. It wasn't the usual polite clapping of galas. It was slower, more thoughtful, tinged with the unease of people who had been caught looking in the wrong direction. Jack lowered his head, his face caught between pride and anguish. He hadn't asked for this. He had only wanted to stay hidden. But Lily, with her wide eyes and unwavering faith, had dragged him into the light, not with scandal or spectacle, but with honesty. From the wings, Evelyn couldn't look away. The truth from a rival she could outmaneuver. The truth from a child was something else entirely. It stripped her bare, left her staring not at Jack, but at herself, at the hollowness of her own power. For the first time in years, she felt not victorious, not admired, but pierced. And she knew, as the applause grew around Lily's small frame, that a wound like this wouldn't heal with money or control. It would linger, forcing her to confront the one thing she had built her life to avoid, the reflection of who she truly was. The night after the gala, Evelyn's office in Brenton Tower was lit like a stage. The city outside flickered with neon and headlights, but inside the glass box it was just her, a half-empty glass of whiskey, and the reflection she didn't care to study too long. Her mask was back in place, sharp lines, sharper posture, but something beneath it quivered in a way she hadn't felt in years. Lily's voice still echoed through her, that unshakable declaration about her father, each word cutting deeper than any rival's attack ever had. The knock on her door came once, crisp, before Gregory Stiles stepped inside without waiting for permission. He never did. Gregory had the polished look of a man who thought mirrors existed for him alone. Impeccable suit, hair silvered just enough to seem distinguished, and eyes as sharp and cold as blades. He moved like he owned every room, but with Evelyn, his stride was cautious. She had built him, after all. "Evelyn," he said smoothly, shutting the door behind him, "we need to talk about your janitor problem." Her jaw tightened, but she didn't answer right away. Gregory placed a file on her desk, his manicured fingers tapping it like a gavel. "Word is spreading faster than we can contain. A janitor who talks like a strategist, a daughter who takes the stage and makes half the donors cry. The narrative is dangerous." "Dangerous," she repeated softly, swirling the amber liquid in her glass. "Yes." His voice hardened. "The press catches a whiff of this, and it won't matter what the truth is. They'll spin it. A rags-to-riches fable that paints you as the villain, the billionaire CEO humbled by the help. Do you really want that headline? Do you want to hand them your crown just to protect a man who wipes tables for a living?" Evelyn set her glass down with a sharp click. "You think I care about being humbled?" "I think you care about survival," Gregory snapped. His usual polish cracked just enough to reveal the iron beneath. "Fire him, quietly. Pay him off. Relocate him, whatever it takes. But he cannot stay here, not with this kind of attention brewing." The room fell still. Evelyn leaned back in her chair, her eyes locked on the city skyline instead of Gregory's hungry stare. For years she had listened to men like him, men who thrived on control, on spinning every truth into a weapon. She had believed it was the only way to win. But Jack's calm voice in the boardroom, Lily's steady courage on stage, those weren't spin. They were something she hadn't seen in years, unvarnished truth. "Gregory," she said at last, her tone measured, "do you know what unsettled me about him?" Greg blinked, caught off guard. "Unsettled you?" He didn't ask for anything. Not recognition, not leverage, not even respect. He just stood there and told the truth. And She stopped herself, the admission clawing against her throat. Greg pounced on the hesitation. "And you almost believed it mattered." "Evelyn, listen to me. Truth doesn't win. Optics do. Perception does. You built your empire because you understood that. Don't throw it away for a man who knows how to string a sentence together." Her gaze snapped to him then, sharp enough to slice. But inside she felt the crack widening. For the first time, she wondered if Gregory was wrong. Maybe the empire she had built wasn't proof of strength, but proof of how long she'd been running from the very thing Jack seemed to carry so easily. He had nothing, yet he stood taller than men who owned skyscrapers. Greg leaned closer, his voice low, insistent. "You fire him tomorrow, or you risk everything we've built." Evelyn didn't reply. She stared at the file on her desk, at the neat stack of lies waiting to be deployed if she gave the word. Her hand hovered near the glass again, but she didn't lift it this time. Survival had always been her default, but tonight, survival tasted like ash. For the first time in her career, Evelyn Hart hesitated. Not because she was weak, but because the truth, raw and inconvenient, was tugging harder than the voice of the man who had taught her how to win at any cost. And she wasn't sure which path terrified her more, losing the empire she had built or admitting that the janitor she once mocked might hold the answer she had been chasing her entire life. The rooftop garden of Brenton Tower was nearly empty. The city stretched out in every direction like a living constellation. Evelyn Hart stood near the edge, her arms folded against the chill wind, the hum of traffic below a distant whisper. She wasn't used to waiting for anyone. But tonight, she waited. The file Gregory had placed on her desk still burned in her mind, every page a reminder of how she had always dealt with problems. Eliminate, control, silence. But this wasn't a problem she could smother. This was a man. And for reasons she couldn't articulate, she needed to hear the truth from him. Jack arrived without pretense. No suit, no disguise, just the same coveralls he had worn in the boardroom, his boots carrying the dust of work across stone tiles meant for champagne receptions. He didn't ask why she had summoned him. He didn't even look unsettled by her presence. Instead, he leaned against the railing a few feet away, his posture quiet, steady, as if he were bracing against a storm no one else could feel. "Who are you really?" Evelyn asked, her voice sharper than she intended. It wasn't mockery this time, it was hunger. Jack looked out at the skyline, the towers shimmering like promises no one could keep. His silence stretched long enough for her to think he might refuse. But then, in a voice low and even, he began. "Once," he said, "I was a name people remembered. I was on track to run divisions, maybe even my own firm one day. I built teams, closed deals, signed contracts that reshaped more than one balance sheet. They called me rising, they called me relentless, and for a while I thought that was enough." Evelyn's gaze didn't waver, though something in her chest tightened. She had lived that language, relentless, rising, unstoppable. He exhaled slowly, his hands resting on the railing. Then Rachel got sick. My wife. By the time they found it, there wasn't much anyone could do. The fight was short, cruel. When she was gone, I had a newborn in my arms, and a decision staring me in the face. Keep climbing or raise her. So I walked away. His voice didn't crack, but Evelyn felt the weight of it press against her ribs. He turned finally, his eyes steady on hers. I never regretted it. Not once. Lily needed me. She still does. But the world doesn't like men who step down. They called me weak. They laughed when I took the kind of job no resume could justify. Invisible work. Work they thought was beneath me, and I let them. Because survival doesn't come with applause. The honesty in his words hit her harder than any rival's insult ever had. Evelyn had built her empire by wearing masks, by turning every loss into a polished performance, every weakness into a sharper edge. But here was a man who had walked through fire and hadn't bothered to hide the scars. He didn't dress his story in excuses or spin. He laid it bare, raw and steady. She swallowed, the taste of wine from earlier still bitter on her tongue. For the first time in years, she didn't see someone to mock, to manage, to control. She saw what she had spent her whole life pretending to understand: sacrifice. Not the kind she boasted about in speeches, but the kind that strips a life to its bones and demands you keep going anyway. "You chose fatherhood over fortune," she said quietly. Jack nodded once. "And the world called it failure. But she's the only thing I ever built that mattered." The city lights flickered against his face, and Evelyn felt something twist deep inside, something that had been buried under ambition and armor for decades. He wasn't a janitor. He wasn't even a fallen executive. He was a man who had lived truth while she had only ever performed it. And standing beside him for the first time in her life, Evelyn Hart felt the sharp sting of envy, not for his power, but for his freedom. The boardroom had never felt colder. Morning sunlight spilled across the glass walls, but it did nothing to warm the polished wood or the leather chairs arranged in their rigid circle. The men and women seated there wore expressions sharp as knives, their tailored suits immaculate, their pens poised like weapons. At the head of the table, Evelyn Hart sat straight-backed, her chin lifted, though a flicker of something unfamiliar lingered in her eyes. For the first time in years, she wasn't entirely certain she controlled the room. The whispers had grown too loud to ignore. A CEO softening, a queen bending toward the help, a woman distracted by sentiment, The board had convened not to debate strategy or acquisitions, but to judge her. Gregory Stiles sat smugly near the center, his eyes glinting with triumph as though he'd already carved her epitaph. The door opened and Jack Marlowe stepped inside. No suit, no tie, just the same uniform he wore when he swept their halls and polished their tables. He didn't flinch at the dozen pairs of eyes that turned toward him, eyes that expected obedience, maybe shame. Instead, he carried himself with the quiet certainty of a man who had nothing left to prove. "Mr. Marlowe," one of the board members said, his voice cool, rehearsed, "you've been summoned to provide clarity. There are concerns about your presence in recent events and about Ms. Hart's conduct in relation to you. Before we proceed, we'd like to hear your account." Jack's gaze moved slowly around the room, pausing just long enough to let the silence deepen. Then he spoke, his voice calm but carrying weight that made every ear lean closer. "You want my account?" he said softly. "Fine. But let's be honest about what this is. This isn't about me. It's about what you're afraid of. You're not afraid of a janitor speaking out of turn. You're afraid that for the first time someone reminded you what leadership is supposed to look like." The words cracked through the air, shattering the practiced calm of the room. A few board members stiffened, others frowned. Evelyn's breath caught, though her face betrayed nothing. "Leadership," Jack continued, his hands resting lightly on the back of a chair, "isn't measured by the size of the building you own or the number of zeros in a contract. It's measured by how you carry the weight of the people who depend on you. Somewhere along the way, you forgot that. You turned power into performance. You confuse arrogance with authority." Greg shifted in his seat, lips tightening, but Jack pressed on. "I've watched you mock the people who clean your floors, who pour your drinks, who make sure this tower shines while you play gods behind glass walls. You call that efficiency. I call it blindness, because every empire that falls does so for the same reason. Its leaders forget that numbers aren't the whole story. Behind every number is a life, a family, a cost you've chosen not to see." The silence was suffocating now. Even the city noise beyond the glass seemed to hold its breath. Jack's voice dropped lower, steadier. "I walked away from a life like yours once. I could have stayed. I could have chased the same prestige you worship, but when my wife died, I chose something else. I chose my daughter, and every day since, I've been told that makes me less ambitious, less successful, less worthy." He lifted his eyes, and the weight of them made even the most confident board member look away. "But I know this. I've never once regretted that choice. Because real leadership starts with sacrifice, not with applause." Evelyn's throat tightened. She had worn power like armor her whole life, but his words stripped it away, exposing the hollowness she had tried so hard to ignore. Jack stepped back, letting the silence settle again, heavier now, undeniable. "So, go ahead," he said finally. "Decide if you want a leader who keeps building glass towers while ignoring the cracks beneath them. Or decide if you want one who remembers that towers only stand because people carry them on their backs. But don't pretend you're questioning me, you're questioning yourselves." When he finished, the room was still. No one laughed, no one dismissed him. For once, the walls of Brenton Tower didn't echo with arrogance, but with the unsettling ring of truth. Evelyn sat there, her mask slipping, her chest rising with a breath that felt like the first she'd taken in years. She didn't feel diminished. She felt undone and remade in the same moment, as though his words had reached the place she'd buried long ago. And for the first time, Evelyn Hart thought maybe being reborn was better than never being touched at all. The news hit like an earthquake through Brenton Tower. Within hours of the boardroom confrontation, Evelyn Hart's resignation was announced, her name sliding across news tickers and glowing on phone screens across the city. To the outside world, it looked like surrender. To those inside the tower, it felt like betrayal. Shareholders murmured of instability, executives whispered of weakness, and Gregory Stiles stormed out of the building as though smoke trailed behind him, but Evelyn didn't flinch. She walked out of the top floor with her head unbowed, her heels striking marble like punctuation marks in a sentence she had finally finished writing. It wasn't defeat, it was release. For decades she had built herself into a fortress. Cold glass, sharp edges, flawless walls that no one could breach. Now, for the first time, she stepped beyond them. She didn't want to rebuild Brenton Tower in her image anymore. She wanted to build something else, something quieter, something that mattered. By the week's end, rumors began to swirl about her next move. Some expected her to take another CEO role, to helm a rival firm and claw her way back to the top. Instead, Evelyn stood before reporters in a modest hall, the kind where folding chairs outnumbered velvet seats, and announced the creation of the Hartwell Foundation. Its mission was simple: to support single parents struggling to balance survival with raising children. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The woman once accused of cruelty was now pouring her fortune into compassion. She didn't hide the inspiration either. She spoke Jack's name aloud, crediting his resilience, his quiet dignity, and the courage of his daughter for opening her eyes to what power should be. For Jack, the fallout came differently. The same board that had tried to bury Evelyn now turned their gaze to him. One by one, offers came: consulting positions, leadership roles, a seat at tables that had long excluded him. They dangled money, prestige, the kind of recognition that once might have lured him. He listened politely, his hands folded, his expression steady. And when they pressed harder, he gave them the same answer every time. "I already have the most important job," he said. Then he would glance toward the small figure waiting nearby, Lily clutching her sketchbook to her chest. The words disarmed them more than rejection ever could. Executives accustomed to negotiating billions had no reply to a man who measured value in love instead of profit. In the weeks that followed, Jack and Evelyn's paths intertwined more often, though never in the way the gossip pages wanted. They met in classrooms, in community centers, in quiet offices where plans for the foundation were drafted on whiteboards already smudged with children's drawings. Jack refused any official title, but his voice was there in every blueprint, every outline, every decision. Evelyn, stripped of the mask she once wore, found herself listening more than speaking. She discovered that leadership didn't have to come from control. Sometimes it came from being still long enough to hear the truth. For Lily, it was transformation. She no longer whispered questions about who her father really was. The world had begun to see him the way she always had, though Jack still shrugged away the praise. When asked what he wanted most out of all the change swirling around them, he only smiled at his daughter and said, "Time. More of it with her." And maybe that was the quiet miracle in all of it. Evelyn had stepped down from an empire without crumbling. Jack had turned down prestige without bitterness. Together, they had begun to redefine power, not as something to hoard, but as something to give away freely. The city still shimmered with its towers of glass and steel, its fortunes rising and falling in endless cycles. But somewhere beyond the marble and noise, a man who had once been invisible stood taller than he ever had, not because the world finally noticed him, but because he no longer cared if it did. And beside him, Evelyn Hart, no longer a queen of glass, began to feel, perhaps for the first time, what it meant to be human again. The lobby of Brenton Tower no longer looked like a shrine to wealth. The marble floors still gleamed, the glass still reached high enough to catch the sunrise, but the air inside had shifted. Where once executives swept through with clipped strides and eyes fixed on their own reflections, now parents lingered, children laughed, and young professionals walked slowly, taking in something new. Beneath the towering bronze statue in the center, a figure once meant to symbolize ambition, there was a new plaque. The engraving was simple, unadorned, and yet it seemed to glow brighter than all the marble around it. To those who build with humility. Jack Marlowe stood nearby, not with a mop or a bucket, but with a small circle of people seated in chairs he'd arranged himself. Some were managers, some were students. A few were simply curious souls who had wandered in off the street when they heard there were workshops open to all. Jack spoke to them the way he once spoke to his daughter, steady, calm, never rushed. His words weren't dressed in jargon or designed to impress. They were truths carved from living, from choices that cost him and healed him all at once. Leadership, he told them, isn't standing on top of a tower. It's being willing to carry part of the weight so someone else doesn't collapse beneath it. The room was silent, in the way silence becomes reverence. Heads nodded, pens scratched against paper, and when the session ended, no one clapped. They didn't need to. They left quietly, carrying something heavier than notes, something that would live with them longer than applause ever could. At the edge of the lobby, Evelyn Hart stood, arms folded, not as armor, but as habit. The sharp suits had been traded for simplicity, soft blouses, rolled sleeves, shoes meant for walking rather than striking. She no longer moved through spaces demanding control. Instead, she stood back, letting others take the space she had once dominated. When people approached her, they didn't see the Queen of Glass anymore. They saw a woman who had chosen to start again, to build not empires, but foundations. And she seemed lighter for it. Sometimes she joined Jack's workshops, not to speak, but to listen. And when their eyes met across the room, it wasn't tension or defiance that passed between them, but recognition. Two people who had lived on opposite sides of power, now standing in the same place, building something they didn't need to own. And Lily, bright-eyed, pencil always in hand, sketched it all. She no longer drew lonely towers scraping the sky. Now her sketchbook filled with people holding buildings together, bridges lined with figures walking side by side, families standing at the base of skyscrapers like roots beneath a tree. Her captions had changed too. Instead of "Dad belongs up there," she wrote, "we all belong together." One afternoon, as sunlight poured through the glass, Lily pinned one of her drawings to the wall beside the new plaque. It showed Brenton Tower itself, not cold and imposing, but alive, light spilling from its windows like warmth. Beneath it, figures of every size and shape held the base steady with their joined hands. She stepped back, satisfied, and Jack ruffled her hair with a smile that said more than words. No one applauded, no headlines blared, no photographs flashed across screens. But in the quiet hum of that lobby, children's voices, the murmur of conversations, the scratch of pencils and pens, a new kind of sound filled the air. It was the sound of something fragile and resilient being rebuilt. Hope, not as a grand gesture, but as a steady hum that lived in the spaces people once walked through without seeing. And in that hum, the story found its end, not with spectacle, but with the gentle truth that towers aren't remembered for their height, but for the humanity that keeps them standing. If this story moved you even a little, share your thoughts below. I'd love to hear what part resonated most with you. And don't forget to hit subscribe so you never miss the next story of resilience, hope, and second chances.